In October of 2022, the United Nations announced an ambitious plan to reduce Earth's extinction rate by 90% by the year 2050. That's great news, right? We should all be cheering this bold plan to protect biodiversity, right? Well, not so fast. As impressive as that goal sounds, there's a big problem. We don't know how many species currently face extinction. So we don't really know what 90% of species at risk actually looks like or how close we might already be to that goal. And it turns out that figuring out how many species are at risk isn't as simple as it seems. Hi, I'm here to introduce you to this channel. Every week or two, I'll take you into the fascinating world of data and numbers and try to help you see what's really going on behind the headlines and the hype. Now back to biodiversity. Setting targets to protect the environment is a great idea. But if we want to make progress on those targets, we need to measure how we're doing along the way. That means we need to know what we're working with. It's hard enough to figure out how many species live on Earth today, let alone track which ones are at risk of disappearing. There isn't even a standardized method for measuring biodiversity. This makes it tough to tell whether conservation efforts are working, or even what 90% of the way to meeting their goals would look like. To get an idea of just how difficult this is, consider that the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services estimates that there could be anywhere between 8 million and 1 trillion species on Earth. Most of the species we know about are animals, plants, and fungi. But the vast majority of Earth's biodiversity is made up of microbes like bacteria, archaea, and single-celled organisms. We simply haven't discovered most of the species that exist on Earth. And of those we have discovered, we don't always know where they live or what population size looks like. Even so, scientists have estimated that somewhere between 1 and 5% of known species face an elevated risk of extinction. That still leaves us with a pretty wide margin of error when it comes to knowing how many species are at risk. In recent years, some new reports have come out with more precise estimates. In 2019, one report estimated that species extinctions are currently 1,000 times higher than the natural background rate, and that 1 in 5 species are threatened. Another report published in 2021 put the current extinction rate at 10,000 times the background rate. That's a huge range, 1,000 times to 10,000 times higher than the background rate. You might think that if we had better data on how many species are currently at risk, we could start to understand whether the UN's plan is working. But it turns out that getting a handle on current extinctions isn't the only thing we need to know. To understand how well we're doing protecting biodiversity, we also need to have a good sense of how ecosystems have changed over time. There are a lot of ways to measure biodiversity. Two common ones are species richness, which is the total number of species in an area, and species evenness, which takes into account both the number of species and their relative population sizes. An ecosystem with high species richness has lots of different kinds of organisms living together. And an ecosystem with high species evenness has lots of different kinds of organisms with roughly equal population sizes. Lots of factors can affect both species richness and species evenness. For example, habitat destruction often reduces both the number of species that can live in an ecosystem and their population sizes. That's why researchers often use indices that combine species richness and evenness into a single number. One commonly used index is called the Shannon Diversity Index. Using these kinds of metrics, researchers have found that some ecosystems have been losing biodiversity for decades. For instance, a study published in 2020 found that over a 30-year period, forest ecosystems in the northeastern United States experienced substantial declines in bird species richness and evenness. Those kinds of findings are consistent with other research showing that biodiversity is declining around the world. But even though we generally understand that biodiversity is declining, we don't always agree on exactly how to measure that change. Some metrics focus primarily on how populations have changed over time, while others focus primarily on the number of species present. Still, others aim to capture both aspects of biodiversity loss. If we want to set goals to protect biodiversity, we need to decide which metrics best capture what we're trying to preserve. And that isn't easy. Let's go back to that 2019 report that estimated that species extinctions are currently 1,000 times higher than the natural background rate. That report focused on the rate of species extinctions, but not on changes in species evenness. Other reports have captured both extinctions and changes in species evenness. For example, a 2019 report looked at changes in the abundance of animal populations worldwide. Researchers estimated that between 1970 and 2016, the average abundance of the species they studied declined by 45%. Similarly, a 2021 report looked at changes in the biomass of living things in the oceans, inland waters and forests around the world. They found that between 1990 and 2019, the biomass of species in these ecosystems declined by almost 30%. Some researchers, though, argue that focusing on changes in population sizes misses something important. Focusing on populations implies that as long as we maintain a certain population size, the species is safe. But other factors, such as genetic diversity within species and the roles those species play in their ecosystems, can also disappear once a species is pushed too close to the edge. That's why some researchers argue we should primarily focus on species extinctions as a metric of biodiversity loss. By this measure, the 2019 report that found that extinctions are currently 1,000 times higher than the background rate was a stark warning. But even that report acknowledged that its estimate of current extinctions was a very rough figure based on limited data. With more recent reports suggesting that the extinction rate may be 10,000 times higher than the background rate, some people have interpreted the data as evidence that we've entered a sixth mass extinction event. But even those researchers acknowledged that they couldn't quantify the risk of extinction for most species. So which metric should we use? Should we focus on species extinctions, changes in population sizes, or something else entirely? Well, the answer is probably to use all of them. A 2022 report uses multiple metrics to paint a clear picture of what's happening to biodiversity around the world. It combines data on species extinctions, changes in population sizes, and changes in the ecological roles species play in their ecosystems. Using this approach, the report confirms that biodiversity is indeed declining. But it also identifies specific types of species and ecosystems that are at particularly high risk. For example, the report found that the population sizes of species that live in freshwater habitats have declined more rapidly than those in marine or terrestrial habitats. Having a clear picture of what is changing and how quickly is essential for developing effective conservation plans. We're still far from knowing exactly how many species are at risk of extinction. But that doesn't mean we should throw our hands up in the air and do nothing. With or without perfect data, we can see that biodiversity is declining and we can take steps to slow or even reverse that trend. The key is to use metrics that capture the full complexity of biodiversity and keep track of multiple ways that biodiversity is changing. After all, biodiversity isn't just about the number of species that exist. It's also about the abundance of those species and the roles they play in their ecosystems. And that's what I have for you today. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to see more like it, please subscribe and leave me a comment to let me know what you think. Thanks for joining me. See you next time.